So I have a theory as to why this movie is the way it is. I'm pretty sure James Wan is the kind of guy who knows the ropes of the horror genre, and by that I mean he's probably familiar with some of the more obscure horror films that not a lot of people are, and I'm pretty sure he implements that into his films in one way or another, especially with this new film Malignant, which I recently saw. And you know, I I actually had no idea that this thing existed until maybe a couple months ago when I heard that James Wan was making a new horror movie, and I was like, oh, fuck yeah. And then I read that it was not only a new horror movie, but it was an original horror movie, and I was like, oh, fuck yeah. And then I heard that it was not only an original horror movie, but it was heavily inspired by 70s giallo films, and then I was like, oh, fuck yeah. So that immediately caught my interest, but I noticed something was a little bit off about this movie since there wasn't a whole lot of marketing that I noticed, and not only that, but the movie's not particularly performing well in the box office, especially compared to his previous films, which is kind of a shame to see. Now, we've all seen horror films from the early days, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Yeah, 90s is part of the old days now, that's fucking crazy. And whenever I find myself watching horror movies from the 70s or 80s, I always think to myself, like, man, they really don't make them like this anymore. And what I mean by that is filmmaking has come such a long way since then. Movies have become a lot more cinematic, you know, movies are being shot in 4K, 8K now, acting has gotten a lot better, and movies nowadays have pretty much expanded to like these really big Hollywood products and franchises. It just feels like movies back in the day had this particular charm and personality to them that movies just don't really have anymore. I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. Like, it's really hard to explain, but it's something that is there and that I noticed a lot, and I think a lot of that is due to just a lot of the filmmaking aspects being a lot different nowadays than they were back in the old days. So look, James Wan, he's a guy who they saw The Conjuring, Insidious. He's done a bunch of horror movies. He's one of the most prolific horror film directors working in the industry today. I just recently talked about him in a video I made not too long ago on The Conjuring 3, where I talked about his films and a little bit about himself. And, you know, coincidentally enough, he has a new original horror movie coming out that I absolutely had to talk about on this channel. As mentioned, a lot of people were saying that this is James Wan's version of like a 70s giallo film, and I heard a lot of people also saying that this was his version of the film Basket Case by Frank Henenlotter? Yeah, that's how you say his name. And yes, this movie definitely feels like a 70s giallo film, as well as like sleazy 80s horror movies. You know, stuff like Basket Case, Brain Damage, The Stuff, Street Trash. Why not? I'll throw fucking Street Trash in there. And as I mentioned before, as we all know, those types of movies are very, very different from movies that we get nowadays, because film has come a long way, and we know how to do things better now, so movies, I guess theoretically speaking, have become better. But as a sacrifice, they don't really carry that same charm and personality that a lot of these movies used to have. One of the things that makes 70s giallo films so giallo is the fact that the acting is very expressive and theatrical, and the set design feels so big, and the cinematography is very experimental, doing these weird crazy things that have never been done before. And I feel like Malignant, in a weird way, is trying to capture that same exact feeling that we get from these old types of movies. As mentioned, the movie's not performing particularly well in theaters, and the reception for this movie hasn't been too great either, especially from fans and audiences. And after watching it, I can totally understand why. The acting in here is definitely very theatrical and is not very contemporary at all, and it almost kind of feels like these actors aren't really trying too hard, and perhaps that's intentional. In fact, I know that's intentional because James Wan is just a guy who knows what he's doing. And to sum it all up in a nutshell, I feel like that's exactly what James Wan was trying to do with this movie. He was trying to replicate the same feeling that we got from like old movies back in the 70s and 80s, especially that of 70s, you know, Italian horror movies and just sleazy 80s schlock. And that's kind of exactly what this movie is. Allow me to make a comparison between this film and Ouija Origin of Evil, which was released in 2016, I want to say, by Mike Flanagan. Ouija Origin of Evil is a film that is set in the 60s, and as a result, Mike Flanagan tried to make the film feel as old school and retro as possible by adding like this grain effect to the film. I don't don't believe it was shot in film. Let me double check that. Yeah, the movie wasn't shot on film. It was just made to look like it was shot on film. And he also implemented this cool little gimmick where he included cue marks and cigarette burns at the top right of the screen. And for those of you who don't know what cue marks or cigarette burns are, they're basically like these visual indicators for the projector that the reel of film being used was about to end and that it needed to be changed. So they would include like these little cue marks saying like, hey, you need to change the reel of film. And so Mike Flanagan did that every once in a while. You'll see like the little cigarette burns or the cue marks in the upper right hand corner of the frame. But other than those two things, you know, as far as like the cinematography and the acting goes, it all still feels very modern. Whereas Malignant, on the other hand, James Wan basically said, fuck it, we're just gonna replicate every aspect of like 70s Italian films, and we're just gonna make it, and we're not gonna give a fuck what people think. And you know what? I totally respect the guy for doing that. And not only that, but mind you, the last two films that this guy did were Furious 7 and Aquaman, which are two very, very big Hollywood productions. So at this point in his career, he could have made any movie he wanted to. And this is what he came up with. He could have made another big budget, you know, action movie, horror movie, whatever. But no, he decided to make his own thing. He did this. It really just feels like something that we really don't get nowadays. I'm actually going to look up some of James Wan's favorite horror movies, or like just movies that he is aware of that he may have implemented into, you know, this new movie that he released, because I'm genuinely curious as to what exactly he was going for with this movie. Okay, so the website Mubi has provided us with this list of James Wan's favorite films, which is perfect, because now we get to see a little insight of what's going on in this man's head. So as we can see here, his one of his favorite films is Tangled, which is interesting. Okay, Dead Alive, here we go. Now we're getting into some interesting stuff. Poltergeist, we have Videodrome, Scanners, BMX Bandits. BMX Bandits. Okay, actually this makes sense because James Wan is Australian, and I believe BMX Bandits is an Australian film because it is Nicole Kidman's film debut, and Nicole Kidman's Australian. I saw this in theaters like a couple years ago. I wasn't a big fan of it, but that's just really interesting to see. Here we have classics like Carrie, Halloween, Suspiria, Deep Red. Now we're getting into some of the giallo stuff. Black Christmas, awesome. The Exorcist. Here we go. Black Sunday, Carnival of Souls, and his favorite film of all time is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. All right. So yeah, there you go. There's some insight on some of James Wan's favorite movies and some films that Malignant was possibly heavily influenced by and inspired by. So, okay, my point being, the man knows what he's doing. The acting may not be the best here, and some of the cinematography, again, feels very old school, but all of this is intentional. But I totally understand the mixed reviews that this is getting, because again, the acting and the, you know, everything else, all the aspects of the movie do not meet up to par with, you know, movies that we get nowadays, because it's very, very different. Again, it feels very old school, and I feel like that threw a lot of people off, and a lot of people just weren't expecting that. It's definitely something that we have not seen on the big screen in a very, very long time, and goddamn it, he did it again. The man has redefined the horror genre in so many different ways. The man directed Saw in 2004, which pretty much redefined the torture porn genre, and as a result, a bunch of torture porn movies followed right after, with films like Hostel and Turistas and Frontiers. And then the man redefined the horror genre again with, you know, haunted house horror movies, with Insidious and The Conjuring. And now finally we have the fucking cinematic anomaly that is Malignant, which essentially does the same thing but just on the complete opposite spectrum of the horror genre, with 70s Italian horror movies and 80s sleaze and exploitation. You know, he's doing it all, and hopefully that means we'll be getting more movies like this, you know, more movies that are heavily influenced by the works of filmmakers such as Dario Argento and Mario Bava and Frank Henenlotter. I've recorded so much footage and I haven't even talked about the fucking movie itself. I'm not going to talk about the movie itself, by the way. That, like, there's literally nothing for me to say about this movie. If you don't know anything about this movie and you haven't seen it yet, please go in as blind as possible. Do not look anything up about this movie. And if you already have seen this movie, then you already know. Like, you already know what happens. Like, there's nothing else to add. You know, you've already seen it. It's there. And the reason why I made this video was to hopefully give you some insight on, on why this movie is the way it is, and why James Wan would make such a movie after making such big blockbuster hits such as The Conjuring and Insidious and Saw and Aquaman and Furious 7 and whatever the fuck. And yeah, honestly, the more I think about Malignant, the more I just absolutely love it and adore it and everything that it's doing. Overall, if I had to rate it, I guess I'd give it an 8 out of 10. This is easily one of James Wan's best films to date. Easily like his most unique and original film yet. I mean, yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will be making more videos very soon in the near future. Stay tuned for those. And yeah, I'll fucking
bye.